Rodney, who had a driver's license, had made an arrangement to borrow a car for the day from the farm workers at Metchley, a couple miles down the road. He'd regularly get cars this way in the past, but this particular time the arrangement broke down the day before we were due to set off. Though things got sorted out fairly easily, Rodney walked over to the farm and got a promise on another car. The interesting thing was the way Ruth responded during those few hours when it looked like the trip might have to be called off. Until then, she'd been making out the whole thing was a bit of a joke, that if anything, she was going along with it to please Chrissy. And she talked a lot about how we weren't exploring our freedom nearly enough since leaving Hailsham. How, anyway, she'd always wanted to go to Norfolk to find all our lost things. In other words, she'd gone out of her way to let us know she wasn't very serious about the prospect of finding her possible. That day before we went, I remember Ruth and I had been out for a stroll, and we came into the farmhouse kitchen where Fiona and a few veterans were making a huge stew. And it was Fiona herself, not looking up from what she was doing, who told us how the farm boy had come in earlier with the message. Ruth was standing just in front of me, so I couldn't see her face, but her whole posture froze up. Then, without a word, she turned and pushed past me out of the cottage. I got a glimpse of her face then, and that's when I realized how upset she was. Fiona started to say something like, "Oh, I didn't know." But I said quickly, "That's not what Ruth's upset about. It's about something else, something that happened earlier on." It wasn't very good, but it was the best I could do on the spur of the moment. In the end, as I said, the vehicle crisis got resolved, and exactly the next morning in the pitch dark, the five of us got inside a bashed but perfectly decent Rover car. The way we sat was Chrissy up front next to Rodney, and the three of us in the back. That was what had felt natural, and we'd gone in like that without thinking about it. But after only a few minutes, once Rodney had brought us out of the dark winding lanes onto the proper roads, Ruth, who was in the middle, leaned forward, put her hands on the front seats, and began talking to the two veterans. She did this in a way that meant Tommy and I, on either side of her, couldn't hear anything they were saying, and because she was between us, couldn't talk to or even see each other. Sometimes, on the rare occasions she did lean back, I tried to get something going between the three of us, but Ruth wouldn't pick up on it, and before long she'd be crouched forward again, her face stuck between the two front seats. After about an hour, with day starting to break, we stopped to stretch our legs and let Rodney go for a pee. We'd pulled over beside a big empty field, so we jumped over the ditch and spent a few minutes rubbing our hands together and watching our breaths rise. At one point, I noticed Ruth had drifted away from the rest of us and was gazing across the field at the sunrise. So I went over to her and made the suggestion that since she only wanted to talk to the veterans, she should swap seats with me. That way she could go on talking, at least with Chrissy, and Tommy and I could have some sort of conversation to while away the journey. I'd hardly finished before Ruth said in a whisper, "Why do you have to be difficult? Now of all times. I don't get it. Why do you want to make trouble?" Then she yanked me round so both our backs to the others and they wouldn't see if we started to argue. It was the way she did this rather than her words that suddenly made me see things her way. I could see that Ruth was making a big effort to present not just herself, but all of us in the right way to Chrissy and Rodney. And here I was, threatening to undermine her and start an embarrassing scene. I saw all this, and so I touched her on the shoulder and went off back to the others. And when we returned to the car, I made sure the three of us sat exactly as before. But now, as we drove on, Ruth stayed more or less silent, sitting right back in her seat, and even when Chrissy or Rodney shouted things to us from the front, responded only in sulky monosyllables. Things cheered up considerably, though, once we arrived in our seaside town. We got there around lunchtime and left the Rover in a car park beside a mini golf course full of fluttering flags. It had turned into a crisp, sunny day, and my memory of it is that for the first hour, we all felt so exhilarated to be out and about, we didn't give much thought to what had brought us there. At one point, Rodney actually let out a few whoops, waving his arms around as he led the way up a road, climbing steadily past rows of houses and the occasional shop, and you could sense just from the huge sky that you were walking toward the sea. Actually, when we did reach the sea, We found we were standing on a road carved into a cliff edge. It seemed at first there was a sheer drop down to the sands, but once you leaned over the rail, you could see zigzagging footpaths leading you down the cliff face to the seafront. We were starving by now and went into a little cafe perched on the cliff just where one of the footpaths began. When we went in, the only people inside were the two chubby women in aprons who worked there. They were smoking cigarettes at one of the tables, but they quickly got up and disappeared into the kitchen. So then we had the place to ourselves. We took the table right at the back, which meant the one stuck out closest to the cliff edge. And when we sat down, it felt like we were virtually suspended over the sea. I didn't have anything to compare it with at the time, but I realize now the cafe was tiny with just 3 or 4 little tables. They'd left a window open, probably to stop the place filling up with frying smells, so that every now and then a gust would pass through the room, making all the signs advertising their good deals flutter about. There was one cardboard notice pinned over the counter that had been done in colored felt tips, and the top of it was the word "look" with a staring eye drawn inside each O. I see the same thing so often these days I don't even register it, but back then I hadn't seen it before. So I was looking at it admiringly, then caught Ruth's eye and realized that she too was looking at it amazed, and we both burst out laughing. That was a cozy little moment when it felt like we'd left behind the bad feeling that had grown between us in the car. As it turned out, though, it was just about the last moment like that between me and Ruth for the rest of that outing. We hadn't mentioned the possible at all since arriving in the town, and I'd assumed when we sat down we'd finally discussed the matter properly. But once we'd started on our sandwiches, Rodney began talking about their old friend Martin, who'd left the cottages the year before and was now living somewhere in the town. Chrissy eagerly took up the subject, and soon both veterans were coming out with anecdotes about all the hilarious things Martin had got up to. We couldn't follow much of it, but Chrissy and Rodney were enjoying themselves. They kept exchanging glances and laughing, and although they pretended it was for our benefit, it was clear they were remembering for each other. Thinking about it now, it occurs to me the near taboo at the cottages surrounding people who left might well have stopped them talking about their friend even to each other. And it was only once we'd come away that they felt able to indulge themselves in this way. Whenever they laughed, I laughed too, just to be polite. Tommy seemed to be understanding things even less than me, and was letting out hesitant little half-laughs that lagged some way behind. Ruth, though, was laughing and kept nodding to everything being said about Martin, just like she too was remembering them. Then once, when Chrissy made a really obscure reference, she'd said something like, "Oh yes, the time he put out his jeans." Ruth gave a big laugh and signaled in our direction as though to say to Chrissy, "Go on, explain it to them so they can enjoy it too." I let this all go, but when Chrissy and Rodney started discussing whether we should go round to Martin's flat, I finally said, maybe a bit coldly, "What exactly is he doing here? Why's he got a flat?" There was a silence, then I heard Ruth let out an exasperated sigh. Chrissy leaned over the table toward me and said quietly, like she was explaining to a child, "He's being a carer. What else do you think he'd be doing here? He's a proper carer now." There was a bit of shifting, and I said, "That's what I mean. We can't just go and visit him." Chrissy said, "Okay, we're not supposed to visit carers, absolutely, strictly speaking, certainly not encouraged." Rodney chuckled and added, "Definitely not encouraged. Naughty, naughty to go and visit him." "Very naughty," Chrissy said, and made a tutting noise. Then Ruth joined in, saying Cappy hates to be naughty, so we'd better not go and visit him. Tommy was looking at Ruth, clearly puzzled about whose side she'd taken, and I wasn't sure either. It occurred to me she didn't want the expedition sidetracked and was reluctantly siding with me, so I smiled at her, but she didn't return my look. Then Tommy asked suddenly, "Whereabouts was it you saw Ruth's possible, Rodney?" Oh, Rodney didn't seem nearly so interested in the possible now we were in the town, and I could see anxiety cross Ruth's face. Finally, Rodney said, "It was a turning off the high street, somewhere up the other end. Of course, it might be your day off." Then when no one said anything, he added, "They do have days off, you know. They're not always at their work." For a moment, as he said this, the fear passed through me that we'd misjudged things badly, that for all we know, veterans often use talk of possibles just as a pretext to go on trips and didn't really expect to take it any further. Ruth might well have been thinking along the same lines because she was now looking definitely worried, but in the end she did a little laugh like Rodney had made a joke. Then Chrissy said in a new voice, "You know, Ruth, we might be coming here in a few years' time to visit you, working in a nice office. I don't see how anyone could stop us visiting you then." "That's right," Ruth said quickly. "You can all come and see me." "I suppose," Rodney said, "there aren't any rules about visiting people if they're working in an office." He laughed suddenly. "We don't know. It hasn't really happened with us before." "It'll be all right," Ruth said. "They let you do it. You can all come and visit me. Except Tommy, that is." Tommy looked shocked. "Why can't I come?" "Because you'll already be with me, stupid," Ruth said. "I'm keeping you." We all laughed. Tommy again a little behind the rest of us. "I heard about this girl up in Wales," Chrissy said. "She was Hailsham, maybe a few years before you lot. Apparently she's working in this clothes shop right now, a really smart one." There were murmurs of approval, and for a while we all looked dreamily out at the clouds. "That's Hailsham for you," Rodney said eventually, and shook his head as though in amazement. "And then there was this other person," Chrissy had turned to Ruth, "that boy you were telling us about the other day. The one a couple of years above you who's a park keeper now." Ruth was nodding thoughtfully. It occurred to me that I should shoot Tommy a warning glance, but by the time I turned to him, he'd already started speaking. "Who was that?" he asked in a bewildered voice. "You know who it is, Tommy," I said quickly. It was too risky to kick him, or even to make my voice wink-wink. Chrissy would have picked it up in a flash. So I said it dead straight with a bit of weariness, like we were all fed up with Tommy forgetting all the time. But this just meant Tommy still didn't twig. "Someone we knew?" "Tommy, let's not go through this again," I said. "You'll have to have your brains tested." At last the penny seemed to drop, and Tommy shut up. Chrissy said, "I know how lucky I am getting to be at the cottages, but you Hailsham lot, you're really lucky, you know." She lowered her voice and leaned forward again. "There's something I've been wanting to talk to you lot about. It's just that back there at the cottages, it's impossible. Everyone always listening in." She looked around the table, then fixed her gaze on Ruth. Rodney suddenly tensed, and he too leaned forward. And something told me we were coming to what was, for Chrissy and Rodney, the central purpose of this whole expedition. "When Rodney and we were up in Wales," she said, "the same time we heard about this girl in the clothes shop. We heard something else, something about Hailsham students. What they were saying was that some Hailsham students in the past, in special circumstances, had managed to get a deferral. That this was something you could do if you were a Hailsham student. You could ask for your donations to be put back by 3, even 4 years. It wasn't easy, but just sometimes they'd let you do it, so long as you could convince them. So long as you qualified." Chrissy paused and looked at each of us, maybe for dramatic effect, maybe to check us for signs of recognition. Tommy and I probably had puzzled looks, but Ruth had on one of her faces where you couldn't tell what was going on. "What they said," Chrissy continued, "was that if you were a boy and a girl and you were in love with each other, really properly in love, and if you could show it, then the people who ran Hailsham, they sorted it out for you. They sorted it out so you could have a few years together before you began your donations." There was now a strange atmosphere around the table, a kind of tingling going round. "When we were in Wales," Chrissy went on, "the students at the White Mansion, they'd heard of this Hailsham couple. The guy had only a few weeks left before he became a carer, and they went to see someone and got everything put back 3 years. They were allowed to go on living there together up at White Mansion 3 years straight, didn't have to go on with their training or anything, 3 years just to themselves because they could prove they were properly in love." It was at this point I noticed Ruth nodding with a lot of authority. Chrissy and Rodney noticed too, and for a few seconds they watched her like they were hypnotized. And I had a kind of vision of Chrissy and Rodney back at the cottages in the months leading up to this moment, probing and prodding this subject between them. I could see them bringing it up at first very tentatively, shrugging, putting it to one side, bringing it up again, never able quite to leave it alone. I could see them toying with the idea of talking to us about it, see them refining how they'd do it, what exactly they'd say. I looked again at Chrissy and Rodney in front of me, gazing at Ruth, and tried to read their faces. Chrissy looked both afraid and hopeful. Rodney looked on edge, like he didn't trust himself not to blurt out something he wasn't supposed to. This wasn't the first time I'd come across the rumor about deferrals. Over the past several weeks, I'd caught more and more snatches of it at the cottages. It was always veterans talking amongst themselves, and when any of us showed up, they'd look awkward and go quiet. But I'd heard enough to get the gist of it, and I knew it had specifically to do with us Hailsham students. Even so, it was only that day in the Seafront Cafe that it really came home to me how important this whole notion had become for some veterans. I suppose, Chrissy went on, her voice wobbling slightly, you lot would know a lot about it, the rules, all that sort of thing. She and Rodney looked at each of us in turn, then their gazes settled back on Ruth. Ruth sighed and said, well, they told us a few things, obviously, but, she gave a shrug, it's not something we know much about. We never talked about it, really. Anyway, we should get going soon. Who is it you go to? Rodney suddenly asked. Who do they say you had to go to if you wanted, to apply? Ruth shrugged again. Well, I told you it wasn't something we talked about much. Almost instinctively, she looked to me and Tommy for support, which was probably a mistake because Tommy said, to be honest, I don't know what you're all talking about. What rules are these? Ruth stared daggers at him, and I said quickly, you know, Tommy, all that talk that used to go around at Hailsham. Tommy shook his head. I don't remember it, he said flatly. And this time I could see, and Ruth could too, that he wasn't being slow. I don't remember anything like that at Hailsham. Ruth turned away from him. What you've got to realize, she said to Chrissy, is that even though Tommy was at Hailsham, he isn't like a real Hailsham student. He was left out of everything and people were always laughing at him. So there's no point in asking him about anything like this. Now, I want to go and find this person Rodney saw. A look had appeared in Tommy's eyes that made me catch my breath. It was one I hadn't seen for a long time, and that belonged to the Tommy who had to be barricaded inside a classroom while he kicked over desks. Then the look faded. He turned to the sky outside and let out a heavy breath. The veterans hadn't noticed anything because Ruth, at the same moment, had risen to her feet and was fiddling with her coat. Then there was a bit of confusion as the rest of us all moved back our chairs from the little table all at once. I'd been put in charge of the spending money, so I went up to pay. The others filed out behind me, and while I was waiting for the change, I watched them through one of the big misty windows, shuffling about in the sunshine, not talking, looking down at the sea. When I got outside, it was obvious the excitement from when we'd first arrived had evaporated completely. We walked in silence, Rodney leading the way, through little back streets hardly penetrated by the sun, the pavement so narrow we often had to shuffle along in single file. It was a relief to come out onto High Street where the noise made our rotten mood less obvious. As we crossed at a Pelican to the sunnier side, I could see Rodney and Chrissy conferring about something, and I wondered how much of the bad atmosphere had to do with their believing we were holding back on some big Hailsham secret, and how much was just to do with Ruth's having a go at Tommy. Then, once we'd crossed the High Street, Chrissy announced she and Rodney wanted to go shopping for birthday cards. Ruth was stunned by this, but Chrissy just went on. We like buying them in big batches. It's always cheaper in the long run, and you've always got one handy when it's someone's birthday. She pointed at the entrance of a Woolworth shop. You can get pretty good cards in there, really cheap. Rodney was nodding, and I thought there was something a little bit mocking around the edges of his smile. Of course, he said, you end up with a lot of cards the same, but you can put your own illustrations on them. Personalize them. Both veterans were now standing in the middle of the pavement, letting people with pushchairs move around them, waiting for us to put up a challenge. I could tell Ruth was furious, But without Rodney's cooperation, there wasn't much that could be done anyway. So we went into the Woolworths, and immediately I felt much more cheerful. Even now I like places like that. A large store with lots of aisles displaying bright plastic toys, greeting cards, loads of cosmetics, maybe even a photo booth. Today, if I'm in a town and find myself with some time to kill, I'll stroll in somewhere just like that, where you can hang around and enjoy yourself, not buying a thing, and the assistants don't mind at all. Anyway, we went in, and before long we wandered apart to look at different aisles. Rodney had stayed near the entrance beside a big rack of cards, and further inside, I spotted Tommy under a big pop group poster rummaging through the music cassettes. After about 10 minutes, when I was somewhere near the back of the store, I thought I heard Ruth's voice and wandered toward it. I'd already turned into the aisle, one with fluffy animals and big box jigsaws, before I realized Ruth and Chrissy were standing together at the end of it, having some sort of tete-a-tete. I wasn't sure what to do. I didn't want to interrupt, but it was time we were leaving, and I didn't want to turn and walk off again. So I just stopped where I was, pretended to examine a jigsaw, and waited for them to notice me. That was when I realized they were back on the subject of this rumor. Chrissy was saying in a lowered voice something like, "But all that time you were there, I'm amazed you didn't think more about how you'd do it, about who you'd go to, all of that." "You don't understand," Ruth was saying. "If you were from Hailsham, then you'd see. It's never been such a big deal for us. I suppose we've always known if we ever wanted to look into it, all we'd have to do is get word back to Hailsham." Ruth saw me and broke off. When I lowered the jigsaw and turned to them, they were both looking at me angrily. At the same time, it was like I'd caught them doing something they shouldn't, and they moved apart self-consciously. "It's time we were off," I said, pretending to have heard nothing. But Ruth wasn't fooled. As they came past, she gave me a really dirty look. So by the time we set off again, following Rodney in search of the office where he'd seen Ruth's Possible the month before, the atmosphere between us was worse than ever. Things weren't helped either by Rodney repeatedly taking us down the wrong streets. At least 4 times he led us confidently down a turning off the high street. At least 4 times he led us confidently down a turning off the high street, only for the shops and offices to run out and we'd have to turn and come back. Before long, Rodney was looking defensive and on the verge of giving up. But then we found it. Again, we turned and we were heading back towards the high street when Rodney had stopped suddenly. Then he'd indicated silently an office on the other side of the street. There it was, sure enough. It wasn't exactly like the magazine advertisement we'd found on the ground, but then it wasn't so far off either. There was a big glass front at street level, so anyone going by could see right into it. A large, open-plan room with maybe a dozen desks, arranged in irregular L patterns. There were the potted palms, the shiny machines, and swooping desk lamps. People were moving about between desks or leaning on a partition, chatting and sharing jokes, while others had pulled their swivel chairs close to each other and were enjoying a coffee and sandwich. "Look," Tommy said, "it's their lunch break, but they don't go out." I don't blame them either. We kept on staring, and it looked like a smart, cozy, self-contained world. I glanced at Ruth and noticed her eyes moving anxiously around the faces behind the glass. "Okay, Rod," Chrissy said, "so which one's the Possible?" She said this almost sarcastically, like she was sure the whole thing would turn out to be a big mistake on his part. But Rodney said quietly, with a tremor of excitement, "There, over in that corner, in the blue outfit, her, talking now to the big red woman." It wasn't obvious, but the longer we kept looking, the more it seemed he had something. The woman was around 50 and had kept her figure pretty well. Her hair was darker than Ruth's, though it could have been dyed, and she had it tied back in a simple ponytail the way Ruth usually did. She was laughing at something her friend in the red outfit was saying, and her face, especially when she was finishing her laugh with a shake of her head, had more than a hint of Ruth about it. We all kept on watching her, not saying a word. Then we became aware that in another part of the office, a couple of the women had noticed us. One raised a hand and gave us an uncertain wave. This broke the spell, and we took to our heels in giggly panic. We stopped again further down the street, talking excitedly all at once. Except for Ruth, that is, who remained silent in the middle of it. It was hard to read her face at that moment. She certainly wasn't disappointed, but then she wasn't elated either. She had on a half smile, the sort a mother might have in an ordinary family, weighing things up while the children jumped and screamed around her, asking her to say yes, they could do whatever. So there we were, all coming out with our views, and I was glad I could say honestly, along with the others, that the woman we'd seen was by no means out of the question. The truth was, we were all relieved. Without quite realizing it, we'd been bracing ourselves for a letdown. But now we could go back to the cottages, Ruth could take encouragement from what she'd seen, and the rest of us could back her up. And the office life the woman appeared to be leading was about as close as you could hope to the one Ruth had often described for herself. Regardless of what had been going on between us that day, deep down, none of us wanted Ruth to return home despondent, and at that moment we thought we were safe. And so we would have been, I'm pretty sure, had we put an end to the matter at that point. But then Ruth said, "Let's just sit over there, over on that wall, just for a few minutes. Once they've forgotten about us, we can go have another look." We agreed to this, but as we walked toward the low wall around the small car park Ruth had indicated, Chrissy said, perhaps a little too eagerly, "But even if we don't get to see her again, we're all agreed she's a possible. And it's a lovely office, it really is." "Let's just wait a few minutes," Ruth said, "then we'll go back." I didn't sit on the wall myself because it was damp and crumbling, and because I thought someone might appear any minute and shout at us for sitting there. But Ruth did sit on it, knees on either side like she was astride a horse. And today I have these vivid images of the 10, 15 minutes we waited there. No one's talking about the possible anymore. We're pretending instead that we're just killing a bit of time, maybe at a scenic spot during a carefree day trip. Rodney's doing a little dance to demonstrate what a good feeling there is. He gets up on the wall, balances along it, then deliberately falls off. Tommy's making jokes about some passers-by, and though they're not very funny, we're all laughing. Just Ruth in the middle, astride the wall, remains silent. She keeps the smile on her face but hardly moves. There's a breeze messing up her hair, and the bright winter sun's making her crinkle up her eyes, so you're not sure if she's smiling at our antics or just grimacing in the light. These are the pictures I've kept of those moments we waited by that car park. I suppose we were waiting for Ruth to decide when it was time to go back for a second look. Well, she never got to make that decision because of what happened next. Tommy, who had been mucking about on the wall with Rodney, suddenly jumped down and went still. Then he said, "That's her. That's the same one." We all stopped what we were doing and watched the figure coming from the direction of the office. She was now wearing a cream-colored overcoat and struggling to fasten her briefcase as she walked. The buckle was giving her trouble, so she kept slowing down and staring again. We went on watching her in a kind of trance as she went past on the other side. Then as she was turning into the high street, Ruth leaped up and said, "Let's see where she goes." We came out of our trance and were off after her. In fact, Chrissy had to remind us to slow down or someone would think we were a gang of muggers going after the woman. We followed along the high street at a reasonable distance, giggling, dodging past people, separating and coming together again. It must have been around 2 o'clock by then, and the pavement was busy with shoppers. At times we nearly lost sight of her, but we kept up, loitering in front of window displays when she went into a shop, squeezing past pushchairs and old people when she came out again. Then the woman turned off the high street into one of the little lanes near the seafront. Chrissy was worried she'd notice us away from the crowds, but Ruth just kept going and we followed behind her. Eventually we came into a narrow side street that had the occasional shop, but was mainly just ordinary houses. We had to walk again in single file, and once when a van came the other way, we had to press ourselves into the houses to let it pass. Before long, there was only the woman and us in the entire street, and if she glanced back, there was no way she would have noticed us. But she just kept walking a dozen or so steps ahead, then went in through a door into the Portway Studios. I've been back to the Portway Studios a number of times since then. It changed owners a few years ago and now sells all kinds of arty things. Pots, plates, clay animals. Back Back then, it was just two big white rooms with paintings, beautifully displayed with plenty of spaces between them. The wooden sign hanging over the door is still the same one, though. Anyway, we decided to go in after Rodney pointed out how suspicious we looked in that quiet little street. Inside the shop, we could at least pretend we were looking at the pictures. We came in to find the woman we'd been following talking to a much older woman with silver hair who seemed to be in charge of the place. They were sitting on either side of a small desk near the door, and apart from them, the gallery was empty. Neither woman paid much attention as we filed past, spread out, and tried to look fascinated by the pictures. Actually, preoccupied though I was with Ruth's Possible, I did begin to enjoy the paintings and the sheer peacefulness of the place. It felt like we'd come 100 miles from the high street. The walls and ceilings were peppermint, and here and there you'd see a bit of fishing net or a rotted piece from a boat stuck up high near the cornicing. The paintings, too, mostly oils in deep blues and greens, had sea themes. Maybe it was the tiredness suddenly catching up with us. After all, we'd been traveling since before dawn, but I wasn't the only one who went off into a bit of a dream in there. We'd all wandered into different corners and were staring at one picture after another, only occasionally making the odd hushed remark like, "Come and look at this." All the time we could hear Ruth's Possible and the silver-haired lady talking on and on. They weren't especially loud, but in that place their voices seemed to fill the entire space. They were discussing some man they both knew, how he didn't have a clue with his children. And as we kept listening to them, stealing the odd glance in their direction, bit by bit, something started to change. It did for me, and I could tell it was happening to the others. If we'd left it at seeing the woman through the glass of her office, even if we'd followed her through the town then lost her, we could still have gone back to the cottages excited and triumphant. But now in that gallery, the woman was too close, much closer than we ever really wanted. And the more we heard her and looked at her, the less she seemed like Ruth. It was a feeling that grew among us almost tangibly, and I could tell that Ruth, absorbed in a picture on the other side of the room, was feeling it as much as anyone. That was probably why we went on shuffling around that gallery for so long. We were delaying the moment when we'd have to confer. Then suddenly the woman had left, and we all kept standing about, avoiding each other's eyes. But none of us had thought to follow the woman, and as the seconds kept ticking on, it became like we were agreeing, without speaking, about how we never saw the situation. Eventually, the silver-haired lady came out from behind her desk and said to Tommy, who was nearest to her, "That's a particularly lovely work. That's one's a favorite of mine." Tommy turned to her and let out a laugh. Then as I was hurrying over to help him out, the lady asked, "Are you art students?" "Not exactly," I said before Tommy could respond. "We're just, well, keen." The silver-haired lady beamed, then started to tell us how the artist we were looking at was related to her, and all about the artist's career so far. This had the effect, at least, of breaking the trance-like state we'd been in, and we'd gathered round her to listen, the way we might have done at Hailsham when a guardian started to speak. This really got the silver-haired lady going, and we kept nodding and exclaiming while she talked about where the paintings had been done, the times of day the artist liked to work, how some had been done without sketches. Then there came a kind of natural end to her lecture, and we all gave a sigh, thanked her, and went out. The street outside being so narrow, we couldn't talk properly for a while longer, and I think we were all grateful for that. As we walked away from the gallery in single file, I could see Rodney, up at the front, theatrically stretching out his arms like he was exhilarated the way he'd been when we first arrived. But it wasn't convincing, and once we came out onto a wider street, we all shuffled to a halt. We were once again near a cliff edge, and like before, if you peered over the rail, you could see the paths zigzagging down the seafront, except this time you could see the promenade at the bottom with rows of boarded-up stalls. We spent a few moments just looking out, letting the wind hit us. Rodney was still trying to be cheerful, like he'd decided not to let any of this business spoil a good outing. He was pointing out to Chrissy something in the sea, way off on the horizon. But Chrissy turned away from him and said, "Well, I think we're agreed, aren't we? That isn't Ruth." She gave a small laugh and laid a hand on Ruth's shoulder. "I'm sorry. We're all sorry. But we can't blame Rodney, really. It wasn't that wild a try. You've got to admit, when we saw her through the windows, it did look... She trailed off, then touched Ruth on the shoulder again. Ruth said nothing, but gave a little shrug, almost as if to shrug off the touch. She was squinting into the distance at the sky rather than the water. I could tell she was upset, but someone who didn't know her might well have supposed she was being thoughtful. "Sorry, Ruth," Rodney said, and he too gave Ruth a pat on the shoulder. But he had a smile on his face like he didn't expect for 1 minute to be blamed for anything. It was the way someone apologized when they tried to do you a favor, but it hadn't worked out. Watching Chrissy and Rodney at that moment, I remember thinking, yes, they were okay. They were kind in their way and were trying to cheer Ruth up. At the same time, though, I remember feeling, even though they were the ones doing the talking and Tommy and I were silent, a sort of resentment toward them on Ruth's behalf. Because however sympathetic they were, I could see that deep down they were relieved. They were relieved things had turned out the way they had. That they were in a position to comfort Ruth instead of being left behind in the wake of a dizzying boost to her hopes. They were relieved they wouldn't have to face, more starkly than ever, the notion which fascinated and nagged and scared them. This notion of theirs that there were all kinds of possibilities open to us Hailsham students that weren't open to them. I remember thinking then how different they actually were, Chrissy and Rodney, from the three of us. Then Tommy said, "I don't see what difference it makes. It was just a bit of fun we were having." "A bit of fun for you, maybe, Tommy," Ruth said coldly, still gazing straight ahead of her. "You wouldn't think so if it was your possible we've been looking for." "I think I would," Tommy said. "I don't see how it matters. Even if you found your possible, the actual model they got you from, even then, I don't see what difference it makes to anything." "Thank you for your profound contribution, Tommy," said Ruth. "But I think Tommy's right," I said. "It's daft to assume you'll have the same sort of life as your model." I agree with Tommy. It's just a bit of fun. We shouldn't get so serious about it. I too reached out and touched Ruth on the shoulder. I wanted her to feel the contrast to when Chrissy and Rodney had touched her, and I deliberately chose exactly the same spot. I expected some response, some signal that she accepted understanding from me and Tommy in a way she didn't from the veterans. But she gave me nothing, not even the shrug she'd given Chrissy. Somewhere behind me, I could hear Rodney pacing about, making noises to suggest he was getting chilly in the strong wind. "How about going to visit Martin now?" he said. "His flat's just over there, behind those houses." Ruth suddenly sighed and turned to us. "To be honest," she said, "I knew all along it was stupid." "Yeah," said Tommy eagerly, "just a bit of fun." Ruth gave him an irritated look. "Tommy, please shut up with all this bit of fun stuff. No one's listening." Then she turned to Chrissy and Rodney and said, I didn't want to say when you first told me about this, but look, it was never on. They don't ever use people like that woman. Think about it. Why would she want to? We all know it. So why don't we all face it? We're not modeled from that sort." "Ruth," I cut in firmly. "Ruth, don't." But she just carried on. "We all know it. We're modeled from trash. Junkies, prostitutes, winos, tramps, convicts maybe, just as long as they aren't psycho. That's what we come from. We all know it, so why don't we just say it? A woman like that? Come on. Yeah, right, Tommy. A bit of fun? Let's have a bit of fun pretending. That other woman in there, her friend, the old one in the gallery, art students, that's what she thought we were. Do you think she'd have talked to us like that if she'd known what we really were? What do you think she'd have said if we'd asked her, 'Excuse me, but you ever think your friend was a clone model?' She'd have thrown us out. We know it, so we may as well just say it. If you want to look for possibles, if you want to do it properly, then you look in the gutter. You look in rubbish bins, look down the toilet. That's where you'll find where we all came from." "Ruth," Rodney's voice was steady and had a warning in it. "Let's forget about it and go see Martin. He's off this afternoon. You'll like him. He's a real laugh." Chrissy put an arm around Ruth. "Come on, Ruth, let's do what Rodney says." Ruth got to her feet and Rodney started to walk. "Well, you lot can go," I said quietly. "I'm not going." Ruth turned and looked at me carefully. "Well, what do you know? Who's the upset one now?" I'm not upset, but sometimes you speak garbage, Ruth. Oh, look who's upset, poor Kathy. She never likes straight talk. It's nothing to do with that. I don't want to visit a carer. We're not supposed to, and I don't even know this guy. Ruth shrugged and exchanged glances with Chrissy. Well, she said, there's no reason we've got to go around together the whole time. If little Miss here doesn't want to join us, she doesn't have to. Let her go off by herself. Then she leaned over to Chrissy and said in a stage whisper, that's always the best way when Kathy's in a mood. Leave her alone and she'll walk it off. Be back at the car by 4 o'clock, Rodney said to me. Otherwise you'll have to hitchhike. Then he did a laugh. Come on, Kathy, don't go in a sulk. Come with us. I said, no, you go on. I don't feel like it. Rodney shrugged and started to move off again. Ruth and Chrissy followed, but Tommy didn't move. Only when Ruth stared at him did he say, I'll stay with Kath. If we're splitting, then I'll stay with Kath. Ruth glared at him in fury, then turned and strode off. Chrissy and Rodney looked at Tommy awkwardly, then they too began walking again.